I'm Kate, and this week we're going to be diving into the making of a Tudor Kirtle. This is going to be constructed using a pattern from the Tudor Tailor, which is an amazing book that's got all sorts of 16th century Tudor wardrobe. Found a beautiful curtain at Goodwill for $4, and it just begged to be turned into something Tudor. So I decided to start with the basics, do a kirtle. This dress was in part inspired by rain and in part by an illustration I did in my Shakespeare-themed coloring book, Color the Bard, because yes, I am that much of a nerd. I am deeply, desperately obsessed with this Tudor gown and decided that I needed to make it starting with the kirtle. Let's go ahead and get into the making of a Tudor kirtle. This is my first time trying to draft a pattern from instructions in a book, and while it wasn't a rousing success, or a success at all, it was extremely instructive for me. In the book, each pattern is laid out on a grid where each square equals 1 inch. I tried to measure that and then place it onto the pattern paper, but as you might have guessed on this channel, I'm not particularly accurate and not particularly good at math, so it somehow ended up really wonky. Based on my inaccurate instructions, the bodice is about 9 1/4 inches tall. At the widest point around the bust, it is 9 inches wide. Around the waist, it's about 7 inches. From the waist to the bust is 6 inches on the diagonal. It comes in about 2 inches to curve for the armhole, and the strap is 14 inches tall and 2.5 inches wide at the top, and the neckline comes in about 6 inches. Granted, these are all very vague measurements. And the back of the bodice is similar but flat. The center back is about 13 inches tall, the waist is 7 inches long, the side seam is 6 inches at a diagonal, the bust is about 8 inches across, from the waist all the way up to the strap is 16 inches, the armhole curves in about 2 inches, the strap is 2.5 inches wide at the top, and about 3 inches long until it connects to the top of the back, and there's a 3-inch gap for the back of the neckline. The Tudor Tailor instructs to add a 1-inch seam allowance around everything, except for the lacing edge where you'll add a 1.5-inch seam allowance. I cut out a mock-up using the lining of the curtain and tried it on, but unfortunately it was way too big. So I switched gears, pinned the mock-up fabric to the wall, and projected the pattern onto the wall, and that turned out much better. Then it was time to prepare the fabric for making the actual garment. I started by seam ripping apart the fabric to get it ready for sewing once I drafted the pattern. The pattern I made from the projection fit perfectly, so I transferred it onto butcher paper to be able to keep it as a pattern to reuse later on. I made sure to transfer in all the marks, including the seam allowances, so that the pattern would be effective. I constructed the top of the kirtle like a pair of bodies, which is essentially a 16th century version of stays or a corset. It's traditionally strengthened with canvas and or linen buckram to give it structure, and then channels are sewn in to keep the pieces together, and it creates a smooth front that's really elegant. I used the same fabric that I used on my stays because it's canvas-like and thick. The Tudor Tailor also advises that you leave a 1/2-inch gap at the top and bottom of the boning so that you don't poke yourself in the boobs or the stomach when you sit down. I made an on-the-fly decision to sew in boning channels to bone the front of this kirtle. They're about 5/8 inch apart. I started in the middle and I'm just working outwards. I don't have a ton of boning material, so I might not do the very edges, but I'll do the front to kind of keep everything flat. And then next, I am sewing up the side seams and sewing up the shoulders. Now I'm just inserting boning in. I'm using old packaging from the set of boxes we just got. I'm putting it in, pulling it out just a little bit. I've already stitched around all of these edges but left the top free to tuck it in. Then it was time for the scariest part, cutting into the pretty fabric. I placed the front of the bodice on the fold and carefully cut around. I didn't have enough fabric to cut the back on the fold as well, and at this point I thought I would make the garment back lacing. In the end, I decided to go with side lacing instead, so you could cut this on the fold if you're going with the side lacing method. I then sewed all these pieces together at the seams. I pressed all the seams open and then made sure to match everything up so that the lining and the outer shell would be completely even with each other. The Tudor Tailor advises to baste these pieces together, but I was a little bit lazy, so I just very carefully pinned them together to make sure that they wouldn't shift as I was whipping everything down. Starting with the side seams, I began to whip the edges into place. I made sure that there was a lot whipped down here because this is where I intended to insert a little piece of boning and then sew in eyelets to do the side closures. To secure the lining to the outer fabric, I did the stitch in the ditch method where I sewed through the center back seam using spaced back stitches. This is basically just to whip the two pieces together. It's immensely satisfying. To finish off the neckline on the lining layer, I flipped the lining to the inside and stitched across the top, trapping in all of the boning. Then I clipped the curves along the neckline to be able to flip in the fabric and whip it down. Unfortunately, I clipped the curves a little too deeply here, and I had to go back and patch in a piece later. I would do it in a more shallow manner if you're going to do this method, but the Tudor Tailor does say you can also use bias tape to bind the raw edges. I only marked out the seam allowances on half of my mock-up, which later turned into my lining, so here I went back in and traced out the seam allowances to know exactly where I'd need to clip and fold. I clipped the curves around the armholes to make it easier to flip the fabric inwards. But be very careful, and it's better to clip too little and have to clip a bit more later than to overdo it. I pinned everything in place to prepare for whipping down. To give my side closures a little more strength, I cut small pieces of zip tie boning and placed them in front of where the eyelets would go. Then I gently backstitched in front of the boning so it wouldn't be able to move. To put off the moment where I had to hand stitch 5,000 eyelets, I decided to make the skirt. I took the remainder of the fabric I had and cut it in half, and luckily it was just about enough to be skirt length. It might have been ill-advised because the fabric is so thick, but I went for French seams, so I put the pieces of fabric right sides together, stitched all the way along them, trimmed down the seam allowance, then flipped it the other way around and stitched again so that the raw edge is completely encased. Then I measured out the placement for the eyelets. I decided to go about 1 inch apart for each eyelet hole. I was thinking I might do spiral lacing, but then my brain was just too overwhelmed with trying to figure out the measurements, so I gave up and made it even. Then I pierced the eyelet holes using an awl instead of a knitting needle or a meat thermometer as I have in the past. I finally caved and got a set of bias tape makers that included an awl from AliExpress. AliExpress, not AliExpress. It's been a really great investment, so I'll link it below. It was only like $5. I'd highly recommend it to anyone who needs it all. I used downtime during my virtual D&D game to stitch in 5,000 eyelet holes. As monotonous and painful as it can be to stitch in eyelet holes by hand, it can also be really meditative. I'd suggest it, but you could also use metal grommets if you just don't have the time or the patience. I tried 2 different methods for stitching my eyelet holes. There's one where you can pierce the needle through the fabric and have it come out of the open eyelet hole, then you loop it back around and make it tight to draw the fabric back and open the hole wider, and then you pierce through again and continue that way. While that is faster when you can get it, I didn't find that I had as much accuracy, so in the end, I would pierce the needle all the way through the fabric and then put it through the hole. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage pleating the skirt. I pleated it thinking that it would just be temporary, and then the pleats ended up being pretty good, so I left them in. Oops. But generally speaking, I left a 2 to 3 inch panel in the front and then did pleats all the way around that met up again in the back. I'll top stitch all of the pleats in place, and then I plan to seam rip open the top couple inches of this French seam. So oops, why did I French seam it all the way to the top? I wasn't thinking ahead, but I'm gonna undo that, do a little rolled hem on each side, and let that be the opening for getting in and out. I might do a hook and eye closure, might do a tape sort of closure. I'm thinking that I want to keep the bodice and the skirt separate because I might want a history bound in the bodice because it's just pretty rad. I probably won't use the skirt as much for anything, but I am probably going to run into the issue of it being very heavy and needing it to sit under the bodice, which actually comes up pretty high in the back. So I might do some sort of way to tie it or button it onto the inside of the bodice, I might in the end have to just stitch it on and call it a day. My plan right now is to take some dollar store sateen ribbon. Probably going to have to stitch two of them together. I realized making the Bridgerton petticoat, it's really hard to fold this in half and still have enough to sew, especially if you're putting it over something that needs to be finished, like this edge here. So I will probably take two lengths of it, do a zigzag or some sort of stitch across the top, and then finish this edge after I've done stay stitching. Okay, and I'm going to be very careful and not sew over a couple of things. So I'm not going to start with the first pleat in case I need to increase the size of that to make it fit when I try it on. And I'm going to sew up to the opening and stop. I'm going to pin this on to the right side and then I'll stitch as close to the bottom as I can, flip it and whip it. And I fully recognize that doing French seams was probably a stupid idea because this is really, really thick and French seams are kind of best on a thin fabric. I just didn't want to serge all of the inside edges because that just felt not right. And I'm already doing quite a bit of hand stitching with all of the eyelets that I did and all of the whipping that's required on the various stages of this. I'm legitimately so excited about this. I don't even care if it's historically accurate. Fitted the skirt a bit tighter in the front pleat and stitched that in place. I also seam ripped open the French seam for about 2 or 3 inches and stitched it back up here. And then I'm going to take a piece of sateen ribbon and stitch it all the way down, then flip it in and whip it. And this will just be a little placket to let me get in and out of the skirt. I ended up doing an overcasting and then a straight stitch along here, and then I'm going to press that down and whip that on the inside so that'll be a nice finished edge that didn't take up too much space. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of open it flat like that and stitch along there. I could have also done a rolled hem here to finish off the edge. To conserve fabric and to reduce bulk, I decided to go with this method instead. It's totally invisible when the dress is on. I then whipped it down to finish it off and moved on to stitching the binding onto the top of the skirt. Excuse me, sir. No. I love you. Can you get off? So I'm going to try the skirt on now that it's been finished. Ooh, that's tight. And then you got too much booty. Alright, we're in. Oh, it's really swooshy. I don't have a crinoline yet, I don't have a bum roll yet, and I don't have a shift yet. I think that will be the next step, and then the pleats came out pretty good. Oh my god, my solution may just be closing this with pins. That's historically accurate. Not necessarily for this time period, but it's a thing that people have done throughout history, so I might just scavenge it like a little monster. I feel like a princess. Hopefully not one of Henry VIII's kids, though. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like and subscribe because I am going to be making more Tudor outfits. And you can also check out some of my other videos. I did finish off the Lizzie dress series and I made a Bridgerton outfit out of literal trash. And if you'd like to support this channel, our publishing business, Calling Card Books, does have a Buy Me a Coffee account. So if you'd like to support the channel, visit the Buy Me a Coffee link or purchase any of our books, including Jane Austen themed or Shakespeare themed coloring books because I'm a big old nerd. And I think if you're watching this video, you may be a big old nerd too. And that's why I love you. Thanks so much for watching, and in the meantime, keep making.